Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for attending CDC's residency program, Dental Public Health Lecture Series. Today, we're very fortunate to have Dr. Fred Hyman to do a presentation today for this series. And just to give you just a little bit of background about Dr. Hyman, he actually received his DDS from the University of Maryland in 1981. He practiced general dentistry prior to obtaining his master's of public health at the University Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. He started FDA in 1993, and he focuses on the mission of protecting and promoting public health by helping to ensure that human drugs are safe and effective for their intended use. In that role, his primary functions include evaluating new drugs with oral indications for approval, monitoring post-marketing safety of these drugs, and providing consultation to staff regarding drugs with other indications that impact on oral health. His experience has included the review of clinical data to support approval of drugs to diagnose, treat, or prevent oral health conditions, including caries, periodontal diseases, salivary dysfunction. And his work also has appeared in a number of publications, including the Journal of the American Dental Association, the Annals of Internal Medicine, and the Journal of Evidence-Based Dental Practice. I'll now turn it over to Dr. Fred Hyman.
Thanks so much, Gina. Let me share my screen and get my first slide up. And let's go to screen slideshow. All right, can everybody see the first slide?
Yes, I can.
Very good. And I'm going to apologize in advance. About 15 minutes ago, for some reason, my video stopped working. So unfortunately, I think you're just going to see my photo, but otherwise everything should be fine. So to begin, today's talk is FDA regulation of oral health products, and it's the fundamentals. My name is Fred Hyman. I'm a dental officer in the Division of Dermatology and Dentistry in FDA. And of course, there's this disclaimer that I will not be disclosing any information about the existence or the status of any product under investigation that's not public. And the views and opinions expressed by me are not necessarily those of FDA, they're mine. By the end of today's presentation, you should understand the steps of bringing a new drug into the marketplace, identify key differences between the regulation of dental drugs and dental devices, describe the process and importance of post-marketing surveillance of drugs and devices. So in today's presentation, I'll begin with an overview of the FDA regulatory process, which encompasses drugs, devices, foods, cosmetics, and tobacco. We'll then learn more specifics about the drug and device approval process and how they differ, followed by post-marketing surveillance of drugs and devices to ensure continued safety. We'll end the talk with some interactive learning through case examples, and we'll allow time for discussion and questions. Let's start first with the organizational chart of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services to show just how FDA fits in. So the two columns in the center show the 11 agencies that comprise HHS, the most recognizable which include CDC, NIH, and the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid. And you see FDA is one of those 11 that's circled. FDA currently employs approximately 15,000, mostly civilians, but we also have uniformed public health officers from the U.S. Public Health Service. FDA's mission is reflected in its current mission statement as shown in the left column. FDA is responsible for protecting the public health by ensuring the safety, efficacy, and security of human and veterinary drugs, biological products, and medical devices, and by ensuring the safety of our nation's food supply, cosmetics, and products that emit radiation. On the right side of the slide, you'll see the first bullet that FDA also now regulates tobacco products. This came about in 2009 when Congress passed the Family Smoking Prevention and Tobacco Control Act, which authorized FDA to create its Center for Tobacco Products with the mission of reducing the death and disease toll caused by tobacco. To give you an idea of FDA's regulatory extent, see in the second bullet on the right that we are responsible for overseeing more than $2.4 trillion of medical products, foods, and tobacco. To be more specific, this is 20 cents for every dollar spent in the US. This includes 20,000 prescription drug products, 6,500 unique categories of medical devices, 78% of the US food supply, and 90,000 tobacco products. Now, before we go further in this talk, how and why did FDA come into existence? So, other than a few weak individual federal laws in the early 1900s concerning food and drugs, there was no mandated oversight of the food and drug supply in the United States, and it basically took a very high-profile tragedy to effect this change. Sulfanilamide was one of the earliest antibacterial drugs discovered, and it was in use by the 1930s. In 1937, a Tennessee drug company marketed a form of the new sulfa wonder drug that could be used by pediatric patients, sulfanilamide elixir. For the liquid portion, however, the company chose diethylene glycol, which was judged as a good solvent with a fruity taste and a pleasant smell and appearance. The drug company conducted no testing before marketing the product, which was soon found to be highly toxic, resulting in kidney failure, with the death of over 100 people, many of whom were children. Now, at that time, it was not illegal to sell a toxic drug. In fact, the only way that the federal government could pursue recall action was the technicality that the definition of an elixir was mixed with alcohol, and diethylene glycol was not judged as equivalent to ethanol. So as a result of the public outcry that resulted from that tragedy, the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act was signed into law in June 1938 by President Franklin Roosevelt. This act reshaped the drug provisions to prevent such an event from ever happening again. On the right side of the slide, I actually found an excerpt from a letter that was sent to the president by a mother whose child had died from the poisoning. And for those who may not be able to see the text clearly, I'm going to read it aloud. So the mother wrote, quote, "The first time I ever had occasion to call in a doctor for Joan, and she was given elixir of sulfanilamide. All that is left to us is the caring for her little grave. Even the memory of her is mixed with sorrow, for we can see her little body tossing to and fro and hear that little voice screaming with pain as it seems as though it would drive me insane. It is my plea that you will take steps to prevent such sale of drugs that will take little lives and leave such suffering behind and such a bleak outlook on the future as I have tonight." So it's sort of amazing how things have changed somewhat since 1938 in terms of access and the president actually reading letters, etc. The Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act is still in effect today, although with many amendments along the way, largely to improve safety and efficacy requirements. It created the ability of the federal government to regulate cosmetics and medical devices. It required drugs to be proven safe before being marketed, and it added inspections and enforcement tools when necessary. So now that you have the broad overview of FDA in general, I'll focus on regulation of dental products for the remainder of this presentation, starting with an overview of categories where those dental products can fall. A dental product can be categorized as a drug, device, biologic, cosmetic, food, or combination of one or more. Depending upon that classification, different regulations apply. So you'll see under the second bullet, I've listed the 3 centers of FDA where these products can fall. First, the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research for Regulation of Drugs, and this is my center, and we'll use the acronym CDER or CEDAR from now on. There's also the Center for Devices and Radiological Health, abbreviated CDRH. And finally, CFSAN, FDA's Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition. And that's the center under which foods and cosmetics are regulated. Shortly, I'm going to give you an example of both foods and cosmetics with dental health claims. Let's start with drugs. And first, FDA's statutory definition of a drug, both traditional and biological drugs. So on the left side is the definition from our regulations. A drug is an article intended for use in the diagnosis, cure, mitigation, treatment, or prevention of disease in man or other animals, and or articles other than food intended to affect the structure or any function of the body of man or other animals. And on the right, biological drugs are a subset of drugs, and they're different than traditional drugs in that the biologics are isolated from human, animal, or microorganism sources, and they may be produced by gene-based and cellular technologies. So most biologics are complex mixtures that are not easily identified or characterized. Let's give some examples of traditional and biologic dental drugs. So first, on the left, we have prescription drugs, and some typical prescription dental drugs include Arestin, which is the brand name for minocycline hydrochloride microspheres, and these are placed in the gingival sulcus to reduce probing pocket depths in patients with adult periodontitis. Next, there's chlorhexidine gluconate rinse, which is marketed under many brands, and it's indicated for reduction of gingivitis. Covposa is a syrup made of glycopyrrolate, an anticholinergic drug, which our team approved in 2010 to reduce chronic severe drooling in children with developmental disabilities. And the last one under prescription on the slide is a biological drug administered intravenously. Kepivance is the brand name. It was approved in 2004, and it's currently the only drug on the market to reduce the incidence of severe oral mucositis, which is a very common and acute debilitating condition resulting from chemoradiotherapy. Kepivance is a biological drug because it is a human keratinocyte growth factor produced by recombinant DNA technology in E. coli. Unfortunately, because of its potential to be tumor promoting, it's only indicated for treating oral mucositis that results from hematologic malignancies. So there's still no approved drug to treat oral mucositis resulting from chemoradiation treatment for solid tumors, but many are under development. On the right, you'll see that there's a plethora of over-the-counter dental drugs available without a prescription, including fluoride dentifrices and mouth rinses, as well as anti-gingivitis mouth rinses such as Listerine. So believe it or not, the FDA definition of a medical device is nearly identical to that of a drug. Like a drug, it must be used in the diagnosis, cure, mitigation, treatment, or prevention of disease in man or other animals, and or be an article intended to affect the structure or any function of the body in man or other animals. So the difference is that a device must not achieve its primary intended purpose through chemical action or metabolism. So that is, a device works by physical means. So let's see some basic examples. Dental handpieces certainly treat dental decay by removing it, and there's no chemical action involved. Rather, it's strictly through mechanical means. Likewise, as the name implies, dental restorative materials such as amalgam, composites, glass ionomers, etc., restore dental function and therefore mitigate caries, but do so by providing just the physical reconstruction. Dental sealants are similar in that they prevent dental caries once again by physical blockage of causative agents rather than by any chemical or metabolic means. And implants, whether for joints such as TMJ or individual tooth implants, are also devices for similar reasons. Now, traditional bone grafting materials such as hydroxyapatite and tricalcium phosphate are also devices because they're intended to fill, augment, or reconstruct periodontal or bony defects of the oral and maxillofacial region. But again, they do so by acting as a physical scaffolding for the new bone to regrow, not by chemical or metabolic means. Sometimes bone morphogenic proteins are added to the implants or bone grafting devices, making the total product a combination of a device and a drug, or a device and a biological drug, depending upon the drug's derivation. I'll talk more about combination products in a few minutes. Now, here's what I find to be an interesting slide. So on this slide, I've given examples of dental cosmetics and foods with dental health claims. So as stated earlier, most toothpastes and mouth rinses containing drugs, such as fluoride-containing toothpaste for anti-caries, Listerine for gingivitis, or Sensodyne toothpaste that has potassium nitrate to combat tooth sensitivity, they're all regulated as drugs. However, there are quote unquote natural toothpastes and mouth rinses on the market that only contain cleaning and breath freshening ingredients, and therefore they are cosmetics only. They do not require FDA approval before marketing, and they only require FDA oversight if there are reports of safety, such as contamination. Cosmetics is an office within the Center for Food Safety because most of the safety concerns for cosmetics overlap those of foods, such as safety of dyes and a concern for contamination. And although it could be the subject of a talk on its own, the regulation of peroxide dental whiteners has been the subject of much discussion over the years, i.e., is it a drug, is it a cosmetic, is it both? And at the end of the talk, we'll go into more detail on the whiteners. Now, regarding the tie-in to foods and dentistry, in 1990, FDA was given the authority to regulate health claims on foods, which are related to drug claims, but they're much broader. So for example, I'm sure you've all seen cereal boxes that contain a statement that it contains a high level of fiber, which can help maintain heart health. So that's a typical example of a food health claim. Similarly, there's a regulation which allows foods containing sugar alcohols to claim anti-caries activity. And this was allowed after a lengthy review of the literature. So the difference here is, whereas a drug claim may be prevents decay for something with fluoride in it, statements that are allowed for sugar alcohols in food are, for example, sorbitol does not promote dental caries, or xylitol may reduce the risk of tooth decay. And I know it's a very subtle difference between the drug claim and the food health claim, but there you go. Now, as I exemplified earlier with the implant containing a growth factor, combination products contain more than one type of FDA-regulated product, such as a combination of a drug and a device, or a combination of a drug and a cosmetic. One example is fluoride dentifrices, which are a combination drug and cosmetic. Fluoride is the drug component, which helps prevent dental caries. However, toothpastes contain and are labeled to also freshen the breath, clean and whiten the teeth, making it as a cosmetic, as we discussed in the prior slide. Another example of a combination is dental implants that contain growth factors. So the implant itself is a device which replaces a missing tooth, and the growth factor is a drug for enhancing the implant's integration into the bone. In the next few minutes, I'll give a high-level description of how drugs are approved, and then after that, how devices are approved. So first, the drug approval process. Any new drug, whether it's prescription or over the counter, requires a new drug application, which is abbreviated as NDA. The process for biological drugs is nearly identical, but because the regulation of biologics is covered under a different act of Congress, their marketing requires an approved biologics licensing agreement, or BLA. Our drug regulations require that for a traditional drug or a biological drug to be approved for marketing, safety and efficacy must be established with data from 2 or more adequate and well-controlled pivotal trials. The requirement for an NDA to demonstrate safety and effectiveness prior to entering the marketplace was only first established in 1965. So there's not time within this overview to go into the detail of the elements of a well-designed clinical trial, but it can be part of the question and answer portion of the talk if needed. Since so many dental drugs are available over the counter, it's worth spending a minute to give an overview of that process. So unlike the prescription drugs, over-the-counter drugs do not need a learned intermediary to oversee their prescribing or their use. The over-the-counter drug review was established in 1972 to evaluate the safety and effectiveness of OT drug products that were already marketed in the United States as of that date. So in other words, prior to that date, there had been no formal FDA oversight for OTC drugs. And recognizing that it would be nearly impossible, well, actually totally impossible, to review each over-the-counter drug already in the marketplace, FDA created the OTC Monograph system to review classes of drugs and to categorize them as either generally recognized as safe and effective, GRASE, or not, after panel reviews from experts. An example of a dental drug monograph is the OTC monograph for anti-caries drugs. It was one of the first classes of OTC drugs reviewed under the monograph process, and a draft monograph was established quickly. However, because all meetings were conducted publicly by law, and they required review and evaluation of all public comments, the process took many years to formally finalize, and eventually this monograph became effective in 1995. This monograph stipulates the exact type of fluoride and concentrations allowable in US marketed over-the-counter dentifrices. It specifies the wording that's allowed on the label, and it sets testing requirements to ensure that each fluoride dentifrice provides acceptable fluoride release and effectiveness against decay. For the anti-caries monograph, as well as all of the OTC classes of monographs, it only stipulates the regulation of the active drug substance in the product, which is different than when we review a drug today that's not over the counter. A manufacturer can choose their own inactive ingredients as long as they're safe and do not affect the bioavailability of the drug substance. And again, that just pertains to over-the-counter drugs that came in under one of these monographs. And also note that with all the OTC monographs, any OTC drug with an active ingredient that was not in the US marketplace in 1972 needs a full NDA review to be marketed. And as an example of that, in 1990, Colgate decided to add triclosan to their fluoride over-the-counter toothpaste. And it would be an active ingredient to treat gingivitis, which would then be a new claim. Therefore, they had to go through the entire NDA route as any new drug would, conducting pivotal clinical trials to demonstrate safety and efficacy, even though it was an over-the-counter toothpaste.
Hey, Dr. Hyman.
Yes.
This is Cassie. We have one question for you.
Yeah, thanks. And because I can't monitor the chat with my one screen, so thank you.
Of course. The question is, what is fluoride varnish versus other fluoride products categorized as? And is there a difference as to whether the varnish is individually packaged?
You know, not only is that a great question, but I've covered it a few slides down. So I think I can answer that well when we get to that slide. And if it needs further clarification, we'll have plenty of time for questions and answers. How's that?
Sounds great. Thank you.
Thanks for the question. So before beginning a human clinical drug trial, what does FDA require? It's unlawful to conduct a human trial involving an unapproved drug without submitting an investigational new drug application, which is abbreviated IND, and formally receiving the okay from FDA before beginning. This NDA package would need to provide sufficient evidence that the proposed human study is reasonably safe to proceed. The evidence required varies widely depending upon whether the drug substance is a new molecular entity versus already having a history of human use in either another dosing form or for another indication. However, that data traditionally relies heavily on results of animal testing, review of the chemistry and manufacturing controls, and a review of the proposed clinical protocol. FDA is required to complete our review of the IND package and inform the drug sponsor of whether it is safe for them to proceed with their first clinical trial within 30 days of receipt of the materials. Now, assuming that the trial is deemed reasonably safe to proceed, the drug sponsor generally follows a sequence of clinical trial testing that begins with small studies of safety and proceeds to what we call the pivotal trials or the phase 3 trials. And those are meant to be submitted as support of the drug's approval, assuming the results are successful. So starting from the top that's labeled phase 1, you'll see a phase 1 trial typically enrolls 20 to 80 subjects, and the main goal is safety. It's designed to study the pharmacokinetics of the drug in healthy volunteers and carefully monitor the safety through clinical laboratory values and examination for adverse events. Assuming the phase 1 trial has been sufficiently informative, phase 2 trials would be conducted next, during which subjects numbering in the hundreds with the actual disease or condition are evaluated for efficacy as well as safety. Dose ranging is often studied during this phase 2 process, and several endpoints may be used to determine which endpoint is the most meaningful to be used in the phase 3 trials. Now, when we get down to the phase 3 clinical protocols at the bottom of the slide, large numbers of subjects with the actual condition are enrolled, and they receive the final to-be marketed formulation of the drug in its to-be marketed dosing. When the drug sponsor believes that they have completed at least 2 pivotal phase 3 trials that have sufficiently demonstrated safety and efficacy of their drug for its intended use, they may submit an NDA for FDA to review. The FDA reviewers need to decide primarily 3 items to be able to grant approval, as listed in the second bullet. 1, is the drug safe and effective for its proposed use or uses, and do the benefits of the drug outweigh its risks? 2, is the drug's proposed labeling appropriate, and does it contain what it's supposed to contain? And 3, the methods used in manufacturing the drug and the controls used to maintain the drug's quality must be adequate to preserve the drug's identity, strength, quality, and purity. So towards that end, here are the team members who review new drugs, which gives you an idea of who reviews the type of data required before human trials can begin, as well as the scope of data required for approval of a new drug application when all the trials and related data gathering have been completed. First, at the top, we've got and by the way, this is no reflection of the importance of any of the positions. It's just the way I listed them. So at the top, we have the clinical officer, who in the case of dental drugs would be a dental officer, who would review a new drug for evidence of adequate safety support before beginning the first human trial, as well as reviewing all the results of clinical trial information and other safety and efficacy data during the drug development when the NDA comes in. Next, the biostatistician works closely with the clinical reviewer to help interpret the data analysis plan and results for validity. Next is clinical pharmacology, and the pharmacologist focuses on the drug's absorption, distribution, metabolism, and excretion processes. This information is gathered from blood level data at different time intervals during the trial. Recall that even before FDA concurs that the drug is reasonably safe to proceed with human clinical trials, the pharmacologist is relied upon to review the supporting non-clinical or animal data for toxicity. During the NDA review, a large focus of the pharmacologist is on long-term safety, such as carcinogenicity, genotoxicity, and reproductive toxicity that also require animal models in many cases. The chemist evaluates the drug's stability, the quality control, and the consistency across batches, as well as impurities profile. The microbiologist reviews acceptable levels of sterility in a drug, and in the case of antimicrobial drugs, will help assess the microbiologic efficacy. And finally, the project manager coordinates the team's activities throughout the review process and is the primary contact for the drug sponsor and FDA. Let's now describe the lawful marketing of devices, which is somewhat different than drug approval. Modern regulation of devices did not occur until 1976, when the device amendments were added to the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. Devices that had a marketing history in the US prior to 1976 were allowed to stay in the marketplace. Any new medical devices that entered the marketplace after that required one of two main avenues to be lawfully marketed. The first and most common, as the first bullet shows, is called the 510K clearance process, and that's named for a clause in the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act that allows for a device to be marketed without specific demonstration of safety and efficacy if it can show that it is substantially equivalent to a device that was legally marketed prior to 1976, when the modern regulations for devices were created. And note that since this 510K process does not require that they undergo a complete review of safety and efficacy, the term approved is not used in that case. Instead, you may see the term FDA cleared for these type of devices, which simply means they were determined to be sufficiently equivalent to a device that was in the marketplace before 1976. If a device is found not to be substantially equivalent to an already marketed device from 1976, an application for marketing must be approved, which must contain sufficiently evaluated scientific evidence, almost always through clinical trials. And that requires what's called a PMA for pre-market approval application. Since devices by definition are not metabolized in the body, the focus of a device review is more on biocompatibility with human tissues than toxicology, as in CEDAR. Also, one adequate and well-controlled trial is sufficient for the approval of a device as compared with a minimum of 2 trials for drugs. And further, the number of subjects in device trials is generally less than for drug trials. And for the sake of time, I cannot go into more detail on devices now, but I'll provide a link at the end of this slide that has lists many FDA websites that you can learn as much as you want about devices, as well as the other topics of today's talk. Now, many of you have heard the term off-label usage of a drug or device. This means that the drug or device was approved for a certain indication, and the dentist decides to use that product to treat another condition. FDA does not regulate the practice of medicine or dentistry, which is under the purview of each state's licensing board. So unless the off-label use is limited via the state board, FDA does not have the authority to prohibit this practice. However, should a negative outcome result from such use, the clinician would have a much harder time supporting their decision. So I'm going to give two examples, and the second one is going to be the fluoride varnishes, which we had the question about earlier. So one example is silver diamine fluoride that most people in the dental community are now aware of its increasing use. So perhaps contrary to general knowledge, silver diamine fluoride is lawfully marketed in the US only for reducing dental sensitivity in adult dentition. It's not lawfully marketed for anti-caries use. And the reason is that silver diamine fluoride was cleared through that 510K process I described a minute ago as a device by the Centers for Devices. Now, this was based upon the demonstration by the manufacturer that silver diamine fluoride physically occludes the dentinal tubules on the surface of the teeth, and therefore it substantially is equivalent to the pre-1976 device of dental varnishes, and they were on the market prior to 76. So although the manufacturer of silver diamine fluoride has publicly announced that at some point they plan to request approval to arrest dental decay, which is the way it's being used off-label today, I can only tell you that to date there has been no approved NDA for silver diamine fluoride for the anti-caries use. And a similar example is are the fluoride varnishes. So FDA's, again, Center for Devices allows lawful marketing because it's only labeled, if you look at any label, it is only labeled to treat dental sensitivity in adults. And this was the same evidence that it physically occludes the dentinal tubules, and there's no approved NDA for fluoride varnish to prevent caries, and that would be a drug claim. So once again, classic off-label use. And again, if there's further questions on that, we can discuss it in a few minutes when I'm done with the formal presentation. So the last topic I'll cover today in the formal part of this presentation is post-marketing surveillance. So even large clinical trials, as we saw, that might number in the thousands, do not enroll enough subjects to uncover rare adverse events. So a robust post-marketing surveillance of drugs and devices is essential to ensure continued safety. The main system for doing this is FDA's Adverse Events Reporting System, which is abbreviated FAERS, F-A-E-R-S, which compiles reports of adverse events and medication errors as coded into the MEDRA technology, which is an industry standard classification system for adverse events. These reports come from a wide variety of sources, including reporting from manufacturers of drugs and devices, as well as from healthcare professionals such as physicians, dentists, nurses, pharmacists, hospitals, and private practices, and from consumers and patients themselves. If the manufacturer receives the report from any of these reporters directly, they are mandated by law to promptly send the report to FDA. An example of this, most of you dentists at least are familiar with the potential for users of bisphosphonates to experience osteonecrosis of the jaw after an extraction. And bisphosphonates are a class of drugs that are taken to reduce osteoporosis. Well, this awareness, which resulted in FDA action of a class warning on the labels of these drugs, as well as publicizing this risk, it was initiated after FDA received multiple reports from oral and maxillofacial surgeons who early on suspected and reported this association to us. The drug reports that are received are evaluated regularly by a multidisciplinary team in our Office of Surveillance and Epidemiology. If the adverse events are deemed to be related to the drug or device, FDA may take regulatory actions, which can include updating the labeling information, sending a Dear Healthcare Professional letter, or even reevaluating an approval decision. So this ends the formal presentation, and for the remainder of the time left, first, let's do a little review by looking at a few of the interesting regulatory decisions made for dental products. And after that, we'll open the floor or the chat room to questions. So first, tooth whiteners that we mentioned during the talk. Are they cosmetics, drugs, or both? So before I give the answer, would anyone like to make a choice and provide their reasoning? Now, again, I apologize. I only have access to my laptop screen, so I can't see the chat, but if anyone would be brave enough to unmute and give their thoughts, that's fine. Or Gina or Cassie or someone who can see the chat, if you can call out some of the answers or questions, I can take it from there.
Dr. Hyman, one individual said, wanted to get a little bit of clarification on the following, that, okay, many in-office therapies like fluoride varnishes have relatively small market revenue potential, thus caries trials are not possible. So over the past 3 decades, we've seen very few new oral health drugs as compared to the medical industry. And so the question posed is, has the FDA ever considered a marker short of a full caries claim, like remineralization, that might utilize trials that are shorter and less expensive in duration?
So that's a great question. I suspect someone from industry is on the line here, but anyway, I'll tell you what, before I answer this, let's just finish this one slide that has this exercise, because I think this is a nice way of sort of driving home the part of this talk that was describing the difference between how dental products are regulated. So is it possible to hold that for just 2 or 3 minutes? And I'll tell you what, for the sake then of keeping things moving, instead of polling the audience, I'll just go ahead and throw out these 3 examples and I'll tell you the answer, and you can decide silently if you were correct or not about that. So this first example, tooth whiteners, are they cosmetics or drugs? FDA attempted to regulate these products as drugs when they were first introduced in the 1990s, but we were sued by manufacturers of these products who argued that whiteners do not meet the definition of a drug. And the federal judge told FDA that the burden of proof was on us to convince the court that drug activity existed. So the bottom line here is, right now, it could change in the future, but as of now, these tooth whiteners, which can include peroxides up to, well, they're getting up there with strength. They are only regulated as cosmetics right now. FDA's CDER, the drug center, does not regulate them. We have not approved them. And even when adverse events come in, they actually go to the cosmetics group. Now, there is some reason to believe that they should be drugs, but as you saw from the definitions early on, to be a drug, we have to show that either there's something being metabolized or chemically acted upon in the body, or it's treating a certain disease or condition. So we really couldn't argue that it's treating any condition to whiten the teeth, but there is some evidence that peroxide whiteners do affect that change by penetrating through the enamel and actually getting into the dentin, which has a lot more protein in it than just the enamel, which is all mineral, and may actually break some of the bonds in the protein of the dentin, which then makes the tooth look whiter. So anyway, we have been unable to prove that. So anyway, as of right now, we do not regulate, drugs does not regulate tooth whiteners, and as you saw, cosmetics has no pre-marketing regulation. All right, the second example, which I think is interesting, is what about fluoride in bottled water? Do we think that's a drug? Do we think it's a device? I don't think we think it's a cosmetic. Do we think it's a food? So again, you can all hazard guesses silently, but fluoride in bottled water is regulated as a beverage. Fluoride is regulated as, in other words, bottled water is regulated by foods as a food. Beverage is a type of food. And Foods wrote a statute that if you add fluoride to bottled water, it has to be at the same level that's recommended in drinking water. It has to be labeled appropriately, and it can contain a claim about reducing the risk of dental decay, but it's considered a health claim, just as I recommended before, as a food, not as a drug claim. So the last example and question we'll give here is, having taken that second response of fluoride in bottled water being regulated under the Food Center, does anyone want to hazard a guess as to how we would then regulate fluoride when it's in drinking water from the tap rather than from a bottle? So the answer to that is FDA doesn't regulate it at all. Anything in the drinking water is regulated by the Environmental Protection Agency. They were established in the 1970s, and the first thing they did was create the Safe Drinking Water Act, which says anything that's in the public drinking water supply other than water is a contaminant. And they then set levels of allowable contaminants. And like any other contaminant, fluoride has a level that it can't go over. And this is of great interest to end on this point, because CDC is the main HHS agency that provides the recommendations on how much fluoride should be in the drinking water, even though EPA carries it out. And you all may know that 5 to 10 years ago, CDC, in conjunction with other HHS agencies, did lower the recommended level of fluoride in the drinking water down to 0.7. It was a range before that went higher. So on that, okay, I'm going to open everything up for questions. And you know what? I'm going to stop sharing my screen at this point so that I can see the chat, etc. And that first question was great. So I can tell, oh my God, there's a lot of questions here on the chat. So let me start with the one, that was a long one, Gina, that you read. I'm trying to see it. Is this the one from Kevin Thomas, I think?
Yes, it is.
Yes.
Yes.
So that's a great question. So here's one thing that a lot of people don't understand about FDA. We only review what people give us to approve. So it's up to the drug industry to make a case for, show the data, make a case for anything they want to do to convince us of drug approval. So the great example here is that is correct, that as of right now, we have not yet accepted remineralization claims to approve a drug for anti-caries. And that's a long and complicated discussion. You know what, Kevin Thomas, are you not, I think we've met before. Do you not, you work for a dental drug development company or consulting, is that correct? Do you mind saying? Well, maybe you do.
Yeah, he probably can't respond the way
okay.
Set up. Yes. So
okay. Anyway, the name just rings a bell to me, and that would be a typical question that a drug or device developer would ask, because dental caries trials require several years, possibly tens of thousands of subjects. a lot of time, most of the time, children figure in largely because they have a high caries rate. And to try to do a clinical trial like that today is exorbitantly costly. You suffer with problems of dropout of subjects over that long of a period of time. It's confounders. It's very, very, very difficult. There's obviously been a large effort to try to come up with the exact point at which demineralization would be clinically significant. And we could say, if this shows X amount of demineralization, we can use that as a claim itself instead of anti-caries. But I have to tell you, the consensus in the dental community, not just FDA, we all know the ICDAS, the International Conference of Dental classification, sorry, of dental, I forgot the rest, but it's a group that's been working on this for years, and it's just, there has not been a consensus. So I could talk for hours about this, but I'm going to let other people answer questions. It's a great question, but we've considered it and we're working on it, and we would love to have an endpoint that is not frank caries, but is some level of demineralization to, sorry, that's the best I can answer that. I hope it's satisfactory for now. And so I'm sorry, I'm looking through the questions, or Jean or Cassie, if you've picked up any while I was talking,
Yeah.
please point me out.
The FDA mandates that you can't hand out samples at dental conventions, unlike toothpaste. The question is, why is that?
So to understand this question, is the person talking about prescription products? Because I'm not aware of FDA not allowing, I got to tell you, when I go to conventions, they throw samples at me. So I'm not aware of an FDA mandate. Now, again, if it's prescription, that obviously is a different story. But I don't know if the person wants to type into chat to clarify that, because if they're talking about over-the-counter toothpaste or things like that, I don't believe we would have any mandate that you can't. If you're talking about prescription, I think that's sort of obvious, because you don't know if the person, the person receiving the sample, it has to be prescribed for them. So that's the whole definition of a prescription product. So anyway, without more information, that's how I'll answer that. Let's see, we have about 10 more minutes and I see other questions.
Yeah, could you, Dr. Hyman, could you address the question about how health apps are classified?
Oh, this is a little out of my area of expertise, but any software is under the purview of devices. So devices regulate software, and apps are just the type of software. And that's actually really become an explosive area recently. And obviously more and more devices are controlled by apps or by software. So rest assured, they are very carefully evaluated, but I can't answer any more because I'm not a member of the Center for Devices.
Okay, and another question is, if silver diamine fluoride were approved for use to arrest active dental decay, would it still be considered a device or a drug?
So no, if the mechanism by which it works to arrest decay or even prevent it would be a number of factors. There's the antimicrobial aspect from the silver ions being released. There's probably some sort of activity with the decayed tooth structure, et cetera. So that clearly meets the definition of metabolism or chemical activity with a part of the human body, in this case, the tooth. So yes, if they make anything with caries, it would have to be approved as a drug, and it would be regulated through the drug process and drug approval.
Just to go back, Kevin Thomas, he did indicate in the Q&A box that he is the former owner of the OMNI Oral Pharma.
Yeah, I thought so. Good to talk to you, Kevin. I think it's been 10 years, but I recall we've had this discussion before. So thanks for attending this.
Okay, and then another question is 1.1% sodium fluoride toothpaste is a prescription that's a drug, but not FDA approved. Can you
Oh,
discuss this? Is it regulated
yes,
differently?
very good. So I wasn't going to go into that kind of detail because of time, but as long as the question came up, yes, the prescription strength fluorides are drugs, and to the best of my knowledge, none has been approved through the modern NDA process, and they should be. So technically, they are not lawfully marketed. What happened was a lot of these products were on the market before FDA required proof of efficacy. So some of them actually came on with safety NDAs, and they were lawfully marketed as considered safe, but that was before efficacy was required. So when the modern NDA approvals came in, they were all supposed to come in and show evidence of efficacy. That has not happened. Again, I can't acknowledge if any are under development or not, but none have been formally approved. Now, what we did, recognizing that not just in dental prescription products, but there were at one time many prescription medical drugs that did not go through the modern NDA process. They were older drugs, and we allowed a certain leeway and gave them time to meet with the agency, develop means to do that, et cetera. So again, I can't really acknowledge whether that's currently going on or not, but technically, those fluoride prescription strength drugs are not lawfully marketed, but they're being allowed to continue to stay in the marketplace for now.
Thank you, Dr. Hyman. I just wanted to make sure to let you know that we really appreciate your really informative presentation today. And just for everyone to know that the recordings will be provided at the Dental Public Health Residency website, and the link is on this particular slide. You can also email dphresidency@cdc.gov with any other questions that you may have, or for maybe future lectures. And then just wanted to let everyone know that our next lecture series will be held on November 3rd. And our featured speaker will be Dr. George Taylor, and he'll be discussing diabetes and oral health, diverse research perspectives. And I think we are almost at time, unless someone has a really burning last question for Dr. Hyman.
Actually, Gina, the only thing I wanted to add, I realized I gave back the screen before I put the last slide, which was a link to FDA websites for more information. So, well, I don't know that we really have to. I was going to say, are the slides going to be available?
Yes, they will be.
Okay, so the last slide has direct links to further information on devices and drugs and post-marketing surveillance, but also you can just go, anyone can go to www.fda.gov and follow links for more than enough information. But I'm sorry, I'll leave it now for any last burning questions before we adjourn.
And Dr. Hyman, if you'd like to show your screen again with the links, we can include that in the recording.
Sure, hang on one second.
And any attendees should reach out to you for slides?
Sure, that would be absolutely fine. Hold on, let me just pull this up and put it in the, and I think it's one more. There we go. So that's the link that goes directly to discuss those three topics. But again, FDA.gov just has a wealth of information about everything. So I guess I just want to thank you for the CDC for the opportunity to present. I know it was a lot of information. I hope we've achieved our objectives, and most of you at least have gotten a good overview of how we regulate a lot of things, and in particular dental products. Once again, thank you. I hope it was useful.
Yes, thanks, Dr. Hyman. And I'll make sure that, I know some people had asked about the slides, and so it's okay for them to reach out to you then, Dr. Hyman, to get those slides?
It is, but again, I'm sorry, I must have misunderstood. I thought, would they also be available, because I know you recorded the session at that link? Would it be possible to just put the slides up there? They've been cleared by my management.
Hey, Dr.
Yeah.
Hyman, we will post the YouTube recording, but to post the slides, we have to go through a different process. So is it best for
Okay.
them to reach out directly to you?
That's fine.
Okay, wonderful.
Well, thank you everyone for your attendance today, and we look forward to you all attending the next lecture series on November 3rd. Have a good day.